Hello, and welcome to Gwinnett County Public Library's Meet the Author program. We are excited to have award-winning Myriam J.A. Chancy join us. My name is Amy Perry, and I'm an adult services specialist with the library. Tonight's program features Myriam Chancy in conversation with Vivian Vonger, who is a GCPL Friends of the Library member and moderator for our ATL Reads Book Club. Please welcome Vivian and Myriam.
Yay! I'm so excited to talk to Myriam.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. You're not just an author, you're a scholar and an activist. So let me read a little bit of your bio. Myriam J.A. Chancy, PhD, is a Haitian American writer born in Port-au-Prince. Her popular novel, including Spirit of Haiti, The Scorpion's Claw, and The Loneliness of Angels. She also has published 2 influential books of literacy criticism, Framing Silence, revolutionary novels by Haitian women and Searching for Safe Spaces, Afro-Caribbean women writers in exile. Her 3rd academic book, From Sugar to Revolution, Women's Vision of Haiti, Cuba, and Dominican Republic, closed a trilogy on Caribbean women's literature. I actually want to read this because I heard a lot of, we're going to have a book called The Island Queen. It's talk about sugar as well.
Yes.
So the whole thing about sugar and that whole Caribbean area is something that I really want to learn a little bit more. Myriam was made a fellow of Guggenheim Foundation in 2014. She has taught in the Vanderbilt University, Arizona State University, Louisiana State University, University of Cincinnati, Smith College, University of California, and currently teaches at the Scripps College of the Claremont Colleges Consortium. The book she's here to talk about tonight is What Storm and What Thunder. Yay! Also, is there anybody attending? The ATL Read is going to discuss her book on July, and I am so looking forward to discuss this book with any reader at all. And I really enjoyed this book. Let's just put it that way.
That's great
put
to
it down. First of all, I would like you to read the first at the very beginning. You have a quote from Frederick Douglass. Can you, read to us about that one?
Sure. So there are 3 epigraphs at the beginning of the novel. The first is an invocation to Legba, who is a Vodou god, an opener of doors, like a trickster figure. And then the second quote that you're mentioning is by Frederick Douglass in 1852, which was a letter that a lot of people actually go back and read in July because it was a letter, what to the slave is the 4th of July. I might be misremembering the exact name of the essay, but it was basically a reflection before the Emancipation Proclamation about what it would mean for a person of African descent in the United States to think about Independence Day. And he wrote, "At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake." And then the last quote is from a film called Concussion from 2015. "If you don't speak for the dead, who will?"
Yeah, I remember that movie. That's the one about the NFL players.
Yes.
Yep. And that doctor was going through a lot of difficulty with the league. Yeah, that was a great movie. So with this particular passage from Frederick Douglass, is there any relationship with your actual title, or
There is some. So it's one of 3 reasons why myself and my editors came up with this title, What Storm with Thunder. My working title when I was working on the novel was actually Douze, the number 12, which is what people in Haiti call the earthquake, because the earthquake of 2010 happened on January 12th of 2010. But after a while the book was in production, my editors were like, well, a lot of people are going to see the number 12 and think 12, not 12, and it's not going to resonate. So let's look for a different title. And I had come across this quote from Douglas, and it really struck me because he talked about the earthquake and this idea that, change will only come in the United States if there is something, irrevocable that happens in terms of the social order, the class order. And I was thinking about how, as a Haitian, because as you mentioned, I was born in Port-au-Prince, the earthquake really split time for us, wherever you found yourself, whether you were in Haiti or outside of Haiti. And there are a lot of milestones in Haitian history, but the earthquake was something unimaginable in terms of a death toll in modern times. I think the second, actually, it comes second to an earthquake in the 1500s China in terms of a death toll. So in history, in terms of modern human history. And so 316,000, we now know, people died, and over 1.5 million were left home insecure and food insecure. And so I was thinking about the way, so I didn't mean to say that we needed something like the earthquake, but I was calling upon this idea that the earthquake changed the social order in Port-au-Prince and changed our understanding of time. I think most Haitians today think of a pre-2010 period and a post-2010 period. But there's also another reference to the earthquake. It comes on page 208 in terms of this idea of thunder and earthquake. And this is why, we started thinking about the title, What Storm, What Thunder. This is in Didier's section, and Didier is outside of Haiti during the earthquake. He's the one who is a musician who's actually not doing very well. He's without papers, stranded in Boston, and he makes a living driving a cab. And he finds in the cab a King James Bible, and he's reading from it. And, throughout his journey that we find him on. So at the beginning of each of the sections that Didier is telling his story, we get an outtake from the King James Bible and actually from Revelation, which is the section that talks about an apocalypse. And so if you find this section on the day of January 12th, he reads in the Bible, and the seventh angel poured out his vial into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven from the throne saying, "It is done." And there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great. And the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of a nation fell. And great Babylon came in remembrance before God to give unto her the cup of wine and the fierceness of his wrath. So this idea of a fallen capital, the divisions of a capital, and that's something I try to explore throughout the novel, the social divisions, the gender divisions, and how the capital fell apart. And so this is partly where the title came from. And then we also found that in Sonia's section, Sonia is the sex worker in the hotel who works there with her best friend, Dieudonné. Dieudonné has a premonition, and he talks about a scent of thunder, something in the air, something that was going to happen. So those 3 instances, the epigraph, Dieudonné's sense of something, a great storm coming, and then the King James reference to Revelation, all help to bring us to this title, which is both a question and a statement. What storm, what thunder?
What thunder. Does the 2020, the 2010 earthquake, does it change? Does it shake the social structure at Haiti and make changes to the society?
Yes and no, because in some ways you could say no, because, here's what I'll say. I think yes, because something like an earthquake of this magnitude and the level of damage, the death toll, where people found themselves in the capital, you really could not escape the reach of the earthquake, in the sense that being very rich didn't mean that you're going to survive better than somebody who was very poor. But at the same time, there were clearly more people who were home insecure, who were in very fragile structures, who were poor. There was a higher death toll among the very poor than among the very rich. And so in some ways, it seemed to level the society. It seemed to make everyone equal in the first days, the first weeks. People helped each other regardless of their social background, class, its belief systems. But then over time, especially in the months and years of rebuilding, it seemed to segment, to re-cement, I would want to say, the structural differences that were already there, so that people who already benefited from some infrastructure benefited more from Reconstruction than people who were poorer. So I would say yes and no.
Okay, because the reason why I'm asking, because I really admire you that you can have you can put your shoes in so many people's perspective, because this book has so many different perspectives, from an expat to someone in Boston to I like Malu the best. Malu is because she remind me of the wet market that my grandma used to go to, because that's the central, right?
Right, absolutely.
It doesn't matter what status you are, that wet market is the social circle for the society.
Everybody has to go through.
Everybody. And those women or any of the vendors in there, like my grandma used to know everybody.
That's right. That's right.
The first thing she did during the morning was that she would get up at 6:30 in the morning, and then she would went to get her exercise, and then she would just sit at that market and just slowly do her grocery shopping and talk to every single humans there, because that's where she get all of her gossip.
That's right. Absolutely.
And you make Malu to become the center of
this.
It make me very resonate on that. She is the center, because she knows almost every single one of these people.
That's right.
You've written. So is that how you want to connect with all the different faces? So you are more or less like you see yourself as Malu, and then you see all of them in all of the perspective?
Well, perhaps the reader does. Maybe having the reader come into the story through Malu and then exit the story with Malu, because the story, for those who are listening or attending who haven't read the novel yet, the novel is told in 10 narrative voices, different ages, different genders, socioeconomic background, but Malu is threaded through. And the characters recur in each other's stories, so you see them again and from slightly different perspectives. But the idea was that I wanted to show that this is a very complex society, that often people will think of Haiti and its poverty and think, well, everyone is poor and of the same, class level, and not think about the ways in which everyone is situated in a slightly different way in that society. And at the same time, I find that because of people's ideas of a country where there is poverty, is that they often don't want to hear from the poorest people. They don't want to hear from the people who are laborers, are market women. My great grandmother was a market woman, and my mother's grandmother was a market woman. And she ensured that, my mother's generation was able to go further. She worked so hard, like you were saying, like your grandmother, getting up so early in the morning and then working, sometimes the grandchildren were working with her, but, she did so much. And one of the things that happened after the earthquake is that often market women were shown, and this happens also with Haiti, even without an earthquake situation, is that we are shown market women in photographs as a kind of emblem of the society. But I have never encountered an interview with a market woman. And so when I was working on this novel, I was thinking, as you were saying, about how the marketplace is a way that brings, it is a space that brings everyone together, because whether you're rich or poor, you have to go through the market to get your staples. But the market woman hears everything. So there are people who interact with the market woman. The market women also get, as you're saying, get their gossip, but there are also those people who disregard the market women, talk over them, talk in front of them. But this is also how the market women end up knowing everything about the society. And so to me, it felt important to make the market woman the cornerstone of this story, because she knows everyone, but she also knows everything about the society, its frailties, its strengths, its possibility for regeneration, and also the areas where maybe it still needs work. And so it was also a way to honor my great-grandmother, who I'm sure no one will ever really know, except in the family. And it was a way of honoring all the work that made me possible.
Because when I read Sarah, she has a lot of, and she see Malu more or less like her grandmother as well. And how Sarah related to how her grandmother worked hard and until the point to provide her a better chance to be.
Absolutely.
And that resonates a lot in this book, is that even though people are not having all the privilege they have, they still continue to strive.
They persevere. They persevere. And I wanted to show, as you're saying, like a character like Sarah, who loses her children in the earthquake, whose marriage falls apart because of the loss of those children, and who's struggling, to maintain her mental health in the midst of those losses, because she loses her home as well, ends up in an internally displaced people's camp. But you're right, she reflects on her history. And I think one of the things that we learn through her story is how important family was or has been for her, which is why, on the one hand, the loss of the children is so intense. But on the other hand, the connection she had with her grandmother is what enables her to survive this great loss, because she sees a kind of continuity between, the grandmother taking care of her when her parents passed on, and then her needing to continue in her present life. And so one of the other things I tried to do was to show, one of the approaches of the 10 narrative voices was to say, look, not everyone had the same experience of the earthquake, and not everyone had the same sense of what should happen after the earthquake, but everyone was in it together. There was a sense of community. There was a sense of, honoring the family and honoring the losses. And I wanted to show all of that through the different characters.
Yeah, it definitely shows. But it's how difficult you are to clearly separate out all the perspective when you're writing this, because as you say, there are like 10 different characters.
Right.
I have seen, author a lot of the time on a point of view, you have one or two or something like that, you have 10.
Right.
And they are different ages, different gender, and different background. How you keep yourself in all this different perspective?
Yeah, well, I have written novels in the past that had multiple perspectives, but not as many as 10. And in fact, when I worked on this novel, there were originally 12 voices, and they were called back to 10. The 12 are still there. There's actually 13, but I never wrote out the 13th character. And so Paul and Loco had their own sections, and those were removed in the editorial process to make the text a little bit leaner. And usually when I write a novel in multiple perspectives, I go from one to the other. And when I wrote this novel, I actually stayed with the voices. It was easier for me because of the intensity of each experience. Writing a woman who loses all of her children, for example, was not something I could, switch off and switch on. I had to write the whole thing through because it was very intense. It was very personal. It was very intimate, and in truth, very painful, because you have to inhabit that character as if it were you. And then I had to take a pause and then go to another character, and so that's how I stayed in the character, because I wasn't moving back and forth between them. Because I think sometimes when you work on a multi-voice novel and you go back and forth, you're doing that partly because the characters are speaking back to one another. They're in the same chronological time and they're speaking back. So you can kind of move back and forth. But with this novel, I really wanted to isolate the experience and also give the reader breaks, because some of the voices are so, or at least the outcomes of some of the stories are so intense. But I couldn't see putting the reader through going back and forth in that experience over, 300, 400 pages. It felt to me like it was better in the same way that it was better for me to write through the story, for the reader to be able to read through an arc and then take a pause and maybe stop and then go on to the next story, even if it had threads to the previous or the next story.
Yeah, I definitely love that because I can read 50 pages or something like that. I can take a pause and then think about it, what you said before I continue. I can make a choice of, how do I want to continue it? And each one of them, they just be together. And it's because when you have multiple perspectives, you start to get confused, especially
that can happen
with the one that jumping time frame, because some of them, they go back and then they go forward, they go back and then they go forward.
Right.
People starting to get confused because I talked to some of my book reader before. Some of them nowadays, a lot of books, they have a portion that one past, a portion of the future.
Right.
And then, actually past, present, and future, and then past, present, and future.
Right.
Some of them, they got confused. They actually need to write down all the stuff. But your book, I find it very easy to follow. And that's why I say, wow. Wow. I mean, you have like 10 voices in there, and you need to keep all this floating so smoothly. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. I want to know, what is the most difficult one for you to write out of all the stories?
Yeah, and I think it might surprise you to find out that the most traumatic narratives, so Sarah, who we just discussed, would be one, and Jonas, her son, who you find later in the novel, the 11-year-old, were actually easier to write than some of the sections like Didier, who I mentioned, the cab driver, or Richard. Richard is the Haitian French water magnate who's multimillionaire. They were actually harder to write, and Leopold, the Trinidadian, the trafficker, they were harder to write because I had to really think about. Maybe it's a gender issue, right? Because those are three men, and I had to think about their motivations differently, but also because they didn't have neat storylines, in the sense that Leopold had to go through this, the earthquake to realize that he was on the wrong path, with his children, with his life. Richard doesn't even realize until the moment that he's swept up by the ocean, a tsunami-like wave, that maybe he's missed out on his mother. His mother happens to be Malou, but he's neglected to take care of her, and his child, Anne, who's an adult by the time we see her in the novel, an architect. He doesn't realize until the end. And as I wrote them, I didn't know that that's what would happen to them. I didn't know how their endings would come out, because I really had to write them out to figure out what made them tick. Whereas somebody like Sarah and Jonas, I knew exactly where I was meeting them. It was perhaps more of an effort to find their voice and to stay in their voice. But once I had the voice, once I knew who they were, it just flowed. It just came almost like they were talking to me and I was writing it, But with the other three, it took more of an effort, and maybe it took more of an effort to sympathize with them because they weren't as likable as characters. And so that's, it's interesting, right? I had to have more empathy for the less likable characters in order to find that place where I could make them empathetic for the reader. And so they took longer to write.
I can understand that, because it's hardest. The thing to do is to find the strength to write the villain, right? And,
exactly.
And give them some redemption qualities is the hardest.
Exactly.
I want to let everybody listening right now is that you can start typing question if you want to, and we are interactive. So whatever you type in, we will trying to get your question asked and trying to answer as much as we can. So
Absolutely.
let's continue. Is that um, you know I think I want to ask is that we know that this is about the 2010 earthquake,
Yes.
and 2020 comes in earthquake again. Is there any difference between these two earthquakes from what you can see from your experience? Um,
Yeah.
would this book still resonate with what happening in 2020 as of right now?
Yeah, I think it would. In fact, I was asked to write a piece which appeared. I wrote two pieces actually in September, October, around that time, because the last earthquake happened
Mhm.
August 14th of 2021,
Mhm.
and the novel was coming out in September in Canada, October in the United States. And I wrote a piece for Oprah Today, which I think people can still find online, talking about the connections between the first earthquake and the present earthquake and the migrant situation along the
Mhm.
border. And I think there are similarities. The difference, of course, is that the death toll was not as high, but it wasn't
Mhm.
as high because the epicenter of the earthquake was in a different part of the country. So the Southern Peninsula, which is kind of an arm, going
Mhm.
west of the country, was affected in August. But the death toll for a modern earthquake was still quite
Mhm.
high. It
Mhm.
was over 2,000 people who perished.
Yes.
And the food insecurity and home insecurity still rose to about 1 million throughout that
Mhm.
area. And
Mhm.
so the devastation was still pretty bad.
Mhm.
And one of the things that we had discussions about around that time, September to November, was the reluctance of some people to give to aid to NGOs because of the misdistribution of money
Mhm.
after the 2010 earthquake. And one of the characters in the novel talks about that. This is
Yes.
Sarah's husband,
Mhm.
Olivier, who is an
Yes.
accountant. And he's
Yes.
kind of, mulling over the numbers only a few months after the earthquake as a way to deflect from his own pain and his own losses.
Mhm.
But he's also giving the reader information about how much money flowed into Haiti
Mhm.
after the earthquake that didn't really trickle down to the most affected people. And so this
Mhm.
is where he has, a theory that if every family that had lost a family member received X amount of money, how much
Mhm.
good that would have done. And of course, that's not
Right.
what happened. And this is not what happens in aid work.
Right.
But it's something to think about, because in 2021, prior to the last earthquake, the
Mhm.
numbers were at 13 billion went into the country. And
Mhm.
then now we're at 16.5 billion went into the
Mhm.
country since 2010.
Mhm.
And it might surprise some people to know that the per capita income is
Mhm.
actually lower today than it was in 2009, the year before the earthquake. So
Oh
$16
wow.
billion went in and out. It was really a revolving door. It really
Mhm.
did not help a lot of people. So the average Haitian, somebody like Sarah, somebody like Olivier, like many
Yeah.
of my characters,
Mhm.
would be no better off today. And there are
Mhm.
still 200,000 people in IDP camps, so without adequate shelter today. And some of those, of course, are from the last earthquake. Before the last earthquake, I think the number was around 50,000 from
Mhm.
2010. And
Mhm.
then, of course, there was been a lot of outmigration. And so one of the things I like to tell people when people say, well, this is about 2010, what does it have to do with today? Is that if you know something about, if you remember the pictures of I think 12,000 to 14,000 Haitians who were at the Mexico-US border trying to get,
Mhm.
asylum in the United States
Mhm.
in the fall, a lot of that migration comes from Haitians leaving from 2010 on, initially at the invitation of governments like the Brazilian government, Chile,
Mhm.
Venezuela. And then by 2012, 2013, many of those visas were not being renewed. In
Mhm.
places like Brazil, there was a huge recession in 2015. And then when we get to the times of a pandemic, so into 2020, many countries, were suffering economic, repercussions from that, and not being very welcoming, to foreigners. And so all that has conspired to keep Haitians moving from Haiti to the Dominican Republic down into Central and South America, and then moving from one country to the next, sometimes after having lived in some countries for some years, have had children there who are actually nationals of those countries, but who are not recognized as having citizenship. And so if people understand more about how extreme the earthquake was, the level of loss, material and personal, and that the rebuilding did not really take place, then they would understand what's happening today. And that it's a consequence of the 2010 earthquake that we see what's happening today happening.
It is very unfortunate. I mean, the amount of money goes in, but nothing really change for the people that we want to see change.
That's right.
And
so
unfortunate.
I did want to say that there were efforts made in the fall to encourage people to find out more about grassroots organizations. And on my website, I do have a page on that if anybody wants to go to my webpage, which is my first and last name.com. You can find more information about organizations that have been working in Haiti for a very long time, from the largest to the smallest, because I know people like to give to groups they know, but you can do some exploring there, whether you're interested in education or children or health, to support organizations that have been very responsible and have made people's lives better.
Yeah, I mean, just like the war of Ukraine, when I donate, I just want to make sure that it goes directly to the people.
That's right.
Not go directly to the organization.
That's right.
Itself, because
that's right.
Because I want those people being helped.
So hold on for 1 second.
Sure.
Hello?
I'm still here. I still hear you.
Sorry, my headphones seems to have
I'm still hearing you.
Okay, good. Thank you. I want to talk about this two hummingbird, and I see a hummingbird behind you. So what is Hummingbird about?
Well, when we were working on the cover, there were lots of different ideas about the cover. And this cover, which a lot of people have liked, was done by the Tin House art director, Diane Chonette. And she came across a passage. She was looking for something natural, but that wasn't too cliched. And she came across a passage. It's in Tafia's section. And Tafia is the 15-year-old who will lose her home and end up in an IDP camp and unfortunately suffer some violence there. But she talks about the sound of the earthquake. And this is something that Haitians who were there at the time talk a lot about. And you will find in different characters sections that they have different ways of describing the sound of the earthquake if they were there. But she says, and this is on page 132 for anyone who has the book, she says, people who had been laughing and fighting 1 second were reduced to lifelessness, their bodies tossed by the side of the road until a truck could pick them up and take them away later, much later. The sound covered us all like vibrating wings of some giant hummingbird. In school, I had learned that hummingbirds could beat their wings 70 times per second. The sound from my own throat joined in the hum because she screams. Didi, that's her brother Didier, would have called it Armageddon, the battle for souls at the end times in the Bible. And so Diane read that and she thought, hummingbirds, a natural image, but it ties into a character's characterization of the sound of the earthquake. And if you've ever had a hummingbird, I live in Southern California, and we get hummingbirds all the time in the backyard. When they whiz by very, very close, it's like a helicopter. And sometimes it feels like a little bomb might go off.
Yes.
And so that's why I was using the image of that sound. And so this is how Diane came up with the cover. But then she also did some research on hummingbirds in Haiti. And these are actually based on drawings by James Audubon, if you know about the Audubon Society. And he had, he did that book, Birds of America. And these were in his book. These are the emerald hummingbird, which are found throughout the Caribbean, but also in Haiti. And it also happens that James Audubon was born in Saint-Domingue, which a lot of people don't know. He was born in Haiti before it became Haiti. Yeah. His father took him out of Haiti when he was 7 years old, just before the revolution happened. And then he would lie about where he had been born. And so, there's another tie-in there with Audubon being from Haiti.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. I got a question. Does writing energize or exhaust you?
It does both, to be honest. I'm just starting to work on my next novel. And every
What is
time,
it about? First of all.
well, I can only tell you the working title. The working title is Sisters, and it's about sisters who have the same father, but who are not brought up in the same family. And they have a connection to they're both Haitian, but their father is Haitian Dominican. So there's they have different connections to the Dominican Republic. And that will allow me to explore, the island, because Haiti occupies the western side and the DR, the eastern side. I actually am a quarter Dominican myself, so I'm exploring the tensions there. And so, so when I think about that project, and I think about how many years it took me to write What Storm, What Thunder, I think, oh my God, I'm not ready for this long haul. I feel exhausted just thinking about it. But every time I start writing, every time I write, whether it's a paragraph or a couple of pages, I feel exhilarated. I feel like, oh my goodness, why was I not writing? So it's a very strange tension. And part of it too is that you get lost in the world you're creating, and which you should, because for the book to be interesting to readers, it has to feel real to them. It has, fiction has to feel real. And so you get lost in that world, and it becomes more real than your actual world in some ways. And so I always have this kind of tension: which world do I want to be in? The real world, or the world I'm making up. But so it's both. And then, of course, when you're in the thick of it, I think it's exhilarating for a long time. And then when you have to hand it over to first readers who are, maybe friends or family, and then editors, and get feedback, there is that initial feeling of like, oh no, there's so much more work to be done. So the exhaustion comes back, and then so there are lows and highs in the writing process.
You got the wave of energy, exhaustion, energy, and exhaustion.
Absolutely.
So I realize one thing is that when I see Haitian writing, I read someone called Marlon James. I believe he's Jamaican.
He's Jamaican.
He's Jamaican. So he has particular rhythm when I'm reading his book, and the same when I'm reading your book with like Malu or Sarah or Olivier, that there is a certain rhythm that kind of lead me to believe that I'm kind of being a native, because when I read that rhythm, and make me kind of transfer myself to be more like that native. Is that is that an intention for that?
Absolutely. And I can't speak for the other writer, but I think that coming from the Caribbean, it has a different kind of rhythm. Time exists differently. Island time, you could call it, exists differently. And then, of course, there's the fact that people are speaking in Creole or in French. French is my first language, and I learned English when between the ages of 8 and 10. And so there is this way in which, because English is not my first language, the way that I think when I'm writing, especially when I'm thinking in terms of Haiti, where I'm drawn back to those rhythms and the way of speaking, and I try to infuse it into the English, so that when you're reading it, aside from when you're reading actual Creole, because I have Creole phrases, which are translated contextually most of the time, you have a feeling that you are in that world, but you can feel the difference. You can kind of feel a shift away from your world into Haiti of this time period. And then you feel immersed in it, but you don't feel completely alienated from it. So the English provides the bridge, but the rhythm provides the intensity of the feeling of being in another place and another time where people are not necessarily speaking English and make you feel part of that world.
Exactly. Wow. That's exactly how I feel, is that
That's great.
I feel like I am at the, seeing through their eye and listening to them. And, I feel like I'm very late. It just makes me feel very close to that character. And I really appreciate that. Here's another question. What is your personal story? When did you arrive in the US and where did you live here? And have you revisited Haiti recently?
Yeah, so my personal story, it would take a long time to explain, but basically, I was born in Port-au-Prince between the two Duvalier regimes. I was born there in 1970. And my parents actually, who are both Haitian, actually met in France, had me in Haiti. Were planning to hopefully return, but the regime made that very difficult. They were both teachers. They actually then moved on to Canada, French Canada, to Quebec City, which is a bit unusual because most Haitians migrate to Montreal, where we did have family. So I'm also Canadian. And then my parents decided that their children should learn English. So we moved to Winnipeg, which most people have never heard of. Winnipeg, Manitoba. Good.
Yeah,
okay. It's a straight shot up from Minneapolis. And I was brought up mostly there. And we went.
Hockey.
Yeah, we used to have a Winnipeg. I shouldn't say, I don't know who's watching, but we used to have a great Winnipeg Jet teams. And so I grew up there, and my parents would work in the French Quarter. We went to French schools, and then we were put right into English schools, like I said, around the age of 8. And then by the time I was 10, I think I was more or less fluent in English, and then did the rest of my schooling there, including my BA at the University of Manitoba. I started out in architecture, actually, when I was 16. Yeah, which is why Anne is an architect. I used knowledge I had for Anne. But then we had a professor dedicated to the architecture school from the English department who told me my first semester that I was a writer. And I was so relieved because I couldn't do the math for architecture, although I've learned since. Most architects that I've met have told me they don't do any math. Engineers do that. And so I didn't know that then. But in any case, I went on and did a master's in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And then I received a SSHRC, which is a big award in Canada for PhD students. I had not applied to do a PhD program, but I had this award. So I thought, okay, I'll do that. And I went to the United States to do that at the University of Iowa. I was not in the workshop. I was in the regular, the workshop is in English, in the English department there, but I was actually in the PhD track and did my PhD there. And I got that at the age of 24. And then I think Vivian told my little history in terms of all the schools I've taught at. So I was tenure track at Vanderbilt, tenured at ASU, and then I did some visiting stints. And I have a chair, an endowed chair at Scripps College. And so, the story of a back and forth with Haiti is more or less like every immigrant. So initially, I was put in school in Haiti when I was 2, and we went back and forth to Haiti for most of my childhood. I didn't actually realize that we lived in Canada until we started going to English school. So until I was about 9. And then when we started going to English school, the family started coming out of Haiti to us more than us the other way around. In terms of visiting Haiti recently, so after the earthquake happened, unlike a lot of people, I didn't rush back into Haiti because I realized it would be a drain on people's resources. But I went back in 2011 and then for several years after that, which is partly where I accumulated a lot of knowledge and information about the aftermath of the earthquake, which went into this novel. But at the time I wasn't working on the novel. I was really just trying to make connections between groups on the ground, sometimes between each other or between funding resources in the United States that, so I did research for some groups that wanted to provide aid and then brought that information back out, interviewing people on the ground about what their needs were to try to get the right matches. So that went on for some years. And then I also went to the Dominican Republic in that time. I stopped going back at a point where it became very painful to return, partly because I just remember a particular trip where a number of 3-star, 4-star hotels had been built with NGO money that should have gone to people who needed better housing. And the parts of the city that I knew were completely transformed and didn't look like the Port-au-Prince that I had known. Not that a city shouldn't change, but it just it didn't seem right. And of course, I was staying with families. I wasn't staying in those hotels, but it was too painful to witness. What's interesting now is that many of those hotels are closed. And then, of course, I haven't been back very recently because in the 2 years before the pandemic, so 2018, 2019, there was a lot of political unrest asking for the then president to step down, a president who was then assassinated last summer, Jovenel Moïse. So the level of instability made it impossible really to go back. And now we're in a situation where there's a lot of demonstrations going on where the local population is asking for the current government to hold elections, to fulfill the democratic process, and to also make the country more secure. Because from what I hear and what I read, half of the capital is under control of gangs right now. So it's a very insecure place to be. So I haven't been back recently for those reasons.
Do you feel like that maybe this is really a turning point for Haiti?
It's hard to say because it feels like the 2010 earthquake should have been that turning point, where there was so much opportunity to learn about everything that Haiti and Haitians have done, for their own history, for world history, and all that has been disregarded. And it feels like Haiti and Haitians were just taken advantage of. It pains me to know that the plan for the development of Haiti post 2010 was the same, and this is a UN-led program, was the same as the plan in 2009. And the plan in 2009 was factory work at, minimum wage that none of us would find acceptable. And there were demonstrations just 2 weeks ago, led by women in Haiti, asking for a raise, for the minimum wage in the factories, many of which produce apparel for US brands, to be raised to the US minimum wage. Of course, that's not happened. And so it feels like there's always this potential for a turning point. People turn out in the streets and demonstrate and ask for their rights, demand for their rights, and nothing happens. And so I'm hoping that a novel like mine can inform people about the very real, human cost for us not to know more about Haiti, and the ways in which people are persevering, but also suffering, because both these things go hand in hand. And so I hope the turning point will be that more people pay attention to the Haitian story and invest in local Haitians who are doing so much to change their country. And that might also be a way to change how aid functions and for other countries, not just Haiti.
Yeah, I think you described the factory situation at Olivier story.
That's right.
He was trying to hold up hope to rebuild his family, but when he went there, he just totally lost all his hope.
He lost all hope, and that happens. And that was part of why his story ends the way it does. Not to give it away for anybody who's not read it, but because there's this way in which Haitians are talked about as being resilient, and I don't think everybody has that resilience. And I know from my own family and friends that there are some people who were never able to put their lives back together after the 2010 earthquake. Some people who committed slow suicide, over time. And so the novel is also hopefully one to make people think about, well, what would you do in your own community? If something like this were to happen to you, what would you want to have happen? And that might inform how you help other people or how you think about other people's countries or nations.
So we have two more questions. So first question, do you sometimes resent what the editors do to your story? How do you learn to trust your editors?
I'll say this. I learned very early on. So I mentioned that I went to college at the age of 16, and so I didn't have a lot of peers, to talk to about my work. And so I would send out my work to literary magazines, which is usually how people start publishing their work. You start with very small literary journals. And sometimes the reactions were very negative, and sometimes they were very positive, very encouraging. But I learned very early on, and I had some professors who were editors too, who would look at my work and tell me. So for example, I had a wonderful professor when I was 17, who told me that I kept using the French comma. And I didn't know there was a difference between a French comma and an English comma. And he taught me the difference. And then now I can deploy, the French comma, which means that you have an endless sentence, in a way that can be useful artistically. But I know the difference between the two. So I think good editors are the ones who make your writing better. They point out the things that are inconsistent, or they point out holes in your narrative that make it stronger. A bad editor, and I think this is where, if the question is, how do you come to trust your editors? If an editor looks at your work, and in my, in terms of my work, because I'm writing about Haitian society, and is asking me questions that betray their lack of interest in Haitian culture, their lack of sensitivity to a difference between American and Haitian culture, they've already taught me not to trust them. But if somebody reads my story and they go with the Creole, they go with, as Vivian was pointing out, that the rhythm is a little bit different, but they then say to me, but we need better pacing in this part of the story, because a good editor doesn't change your story. They actually show you how to improve it, how to go further, and actually how to take some risks with your story, how to take risks that maybe will depart from the norm because they already see you taking a certain number of risks. So they'll push you a little bit further in that direction in a way that will make the work stronger. So I was particularly lucky with What Storm, What Thunder, because I had an editor. My first editor was Canadian, and she loved the story. And she did very little in the way of editing the story, but she really pushed me in terms of its internal organization and doing things like threading through connections between the characters. And then my US editor really was really good at tightening the narrative, so line edits, making things tighter. And so I had no cause. They didn't change anything in any dramatic way because they already loved the story as it was. So I could just flow with their suggestions.
There's another question, very good question, Judith. Do you think your book could be made into a film or a movie or even TV series nowadays and become an opportunity to help people understanding Haitian culture and life?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Judith. I mean, I do think it could help if, because not everybody reads novels. I know we all love reading novels, but not everybody does. Spiegel and Grau did the audio for the novel. So there is an audio version of the novel, which actually inspired some of their agents to believe that it could do well as a film or limited series. And so it is being, discussed. I don't know if that will happen because, of course, it depends on who looks at it and what they think about it. But there is some belief that it could make a very good limited series. And I would love to see that if it did happen.
I would love to know that it will happen. I would love to. I think this is
it out in the universe.
I mean, it is great because I think people need to know more about that 2010 and what happened and all the
Yeah.
different perspectives to know
Yeah,
the whole encounter.
that's right.
I think we probably have time for one last question, and I'm going to tack a little bit on this question. How
Mm,
would you describe your book's ideal reader, and
mm.
also how you want your reader to know, what do you want people to get out after they read your book?
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's an ideal reader per se, because it's been surprising to me how this book has gone out into the world, like the number of different kinds of readerships that have come to it, from very mainstream platforms to, more literary platforms to libraries like yourselves. And so it's been fascinating to see, and I really have to give credit to my publishing house in the US, Tin House, for really getting it out in front of so many different kinds of people. And so I would have to say that my ideal reader is just an open-minded reader, someone who's willing, who doesn't think of a novel as having to come in a particular kind of package. And that's where you have to be open-minded, because there are
Mhm.
some people who want a lot of dialogue, or they want a linear story. So somebody who just comes to the story and is open-hearted, open-minded, and is willing to just go with the story. Because, I worked on this story for many years, and I structured it in such a way that was very, to my mind, very thoughtful. I was
Mhm.
thoughtful of the reader, not knowing who they might be, but there were certain things I wanted to get across. So in that sense, to the second part of the question, I wanted people to leave the story feeling like they had a sense of what happened in 2010, but it was catastrophic in a way that seems immeasurable,
Mhm.
that they would understand that 10 Voices isn't even scratching the surface of what happened here. And that's why there are so many stories, because there are hundreds and thousands of people whose names are completely lost to history now, because there were no records, no real records of who was in Port-au-Prince at this time, and whole family groups disappeared in those 50 seconds, 45 seconds of the
Mhm.
earthquake. And so this is my humble way of trying to put a face on the faceless masses that we think about when we think of a 2010 earthquake. And, what's been especially gratifying for me is that I have had readers who were through the earthquake,
Mhm.
Haitian readers who were there as children, who are now adults, people who are older who have read the novel, and who, family members, even my father read it, a cousin of
Mhm.
mine, two cousins of mine, let me know that it reflected their story. And they all have completely different stories,
Mhm.
from my father, who was outside of Haiti when it occurred, to my cousins, one of who was in Haiti, one who was not, and who say that it captured perfectly what they
Mhm.
went through. And so, you know, it can't get any better than that. When people who survived something horrible, who witnessed it from afar and couldn't be there, or, in some cases, I've had Americans who are not Haitians, who are NGO workers, tell me this is what they witnessed on the ground, to people who had no idea what happened, who just came to the
Mhm.
novel because they saw somebody post about it, for example, and felt like they came away from the novel knowing more about what happened, but also feeling a sense of sympathy and hopefully even empathy for some of the
Mhm.
characters and the losses that real people must have endured. I think I did the best that I could, and the response reveals that I was able to meet that hope that I had for the novel, and that hopefully the story, people will keep reading it and recommending it, and so on. But not every book is for everyone, and so and this is maybe also why it's good not to have an ideal reader in mind.
That's why I like this first page. It just summarizes
Ah,
everything you want to accomplish, especially if you don't speak for the deck, who will?
right.
And that's very
The work of a
important.
writer.
Yep. Well, it's 8 o'clock. I'm going to hand this back to Amy, and really enjoy talking to you.
Same here.
And,
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Vivian, and for all the attendees.
Yes, thank you so much, Myriam and Vivian. Vivian, for your wonderful questions, and Myriam, thank you again for joining Gwinnett County Public Library. You are really an inspiration to us, and not only do you have a beautiful book cover, but a beautiful story that we really can learn a lot about the Haitian culture and the people and what has impacted them. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to reading your next novel. Hopefully you can join us again.
Thank you so much.
thank you.